So David, what's the second story that you have for us today?
This is called The Stranger.
Right.
And this one's a little longer. It's about 10 minutes long. And I'm just going to go over a few unusual words like I did with the other one. To sidle means to move in a casual way that doesn't draw any attention. Threadbare means clothes that have thin spots in them or holes. To shoot the breeze, that means to chat idly, passing the time with your friends. To hold your peace means to keep quiet, not to speak. So there we go. And beat a retreat means to go away in a hurry.
Great.
All right. This is The Stranger. None of us paid him much attention at first. He just sidled along one morning, gave a few nods, asked our permission to join us, as if we owned the place, and sat down against the railing. He took off his spectacles and wiped them on his threadbare coat. We'd been shooting the breeze before he arrived, and things got a bit quiet as we all absorbed this new presence in our group. Not that he wasn't welcome. I mean, when you have as much free time as we do, you run out of things to talk about. You end up going over the same old things or even talking to yourself, so some fresh blood can liven things up a bit. Jake started things off. "Where have you come in from then?" Pretty standard opening line. We never ask each other where we're going to, as none of us really knows, just drifting around as we do, like Jack Kerouac. Turned out he'd ridden the railway down from St. Louis, looking for a warmer place for the winter. That got some understanding nods and grunts. Good for a half-hour discussion too. Everyone dredging up the times they'd been in St. Louis, or met someone for St. Louis. Maybe even just had a passing thought about St. Louis while sitting on the can. Well, that topic dried up eventually and we moved on to other things. Seems like it was later in the morning that someone, it might have been the stranger, started one of those what-if discussions we're pretty fond of. This one was, what if someone gave you $1 million? I mean, if I had a nickel for every time I've heard a bunch of down and outs talking about $1 million. Some folks would look in scorn at a bunch of tramps talking about being rich. But I think dreaming is a healthy thing to do. There's that poem by O'Shaughnessy, "We're the music makers and we're the dreamers of dreams." And then he says, "Yet we're the movers and shakers of the world forever, it seems." See, it's people's dreams that make all the interesting things happen in the world. Otherwise, we're just going along day after day doing the same old stuff. Elgar set that poem to music as well, a great piece. Anyway, when we got into that subject about the $1 million, the guys got pretty excited. Mitch said, "I'd live in the Bahamas and lie on the beach all day sipping margaritas." Fair enough. Lefty, yeah, believe it or not, that really is what he calls himself, just like in the Garrison Keillor show. Lefty said how he wanted a different woman every night. Okay. A few of the guys planned to start up in business. Some pretty wild-sounding business ideas too. The conversation wore on, with me holding my peace as usual. The stranger, Henry was his name, we found out eventually, well, he didn't join them much either. Seemed more of a listener than a talker. And I don't just mean he was silent. He really did listen, paying a lot of attention to what people were saying. I guess he noticed I hadn't said anything, because during a pause, he gave me a glance and said, "What about you, Ian?" By the way, I didn't misspell my name. I-A-I-N. That's really how we spell it where I come from. Sometimes anyway. My first inclination was to fob his question off with a few mumbles. But you don't often get a chance to talk to someone who really seems interested in what you have to say. So before I could help myself, I told him I'd use the money to help people. Well, that got some mocking laughter from the guys, I can tell you. "Listen," said Josie, "when someone has money, all he thinks about is having a good time and making more money." "Oh, I don't know," said Nobby. "What about Andrew Carnegie creating all those libraries? What about Bill Gates giving all that money away to charity?" "Listen, those guys only do that so they can get tax write-offs. Trust me, I know. Plus, it makes them feel superior." And there was a bunch of banter about this, and I shut up. Until Henry gave me a cue to get going again. This guy was good. I wondered if he'd been a minister or something before his crash and burn. As I got going again on my favourite subject, I told Henry how I see us all, and I mean all mankind, as teammates on a large ship, and how we need to pull together if we're not going to sink. I quoted John Donne's lines, "No man is an island, entire of itself, Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Henry's nods kept me going. I talked about creating centres to help poor children learn to read and write, and how I see literacy as key to leading a satisfying life instead of getting into trouble. I talked about wanting to stop human rights abuses in Africa. I talked about my ideas for getting governments to agree to stop tearing down rainforests. As I worked myself up into a passion, the guys stopped their mocking and went rather quiet. Does that mean you can't help anyone if you don't have any money? Henry asked when I paused for a moment. Oh, no. We all have to do what we can. I have a bunch of things I do around town. I go and chat with the old folks at the retirement centre, get them talking about their lives. I help when I go down to the shelter, cleaning up and handing out soup. Sometimes I clean up the litter in the park. The council doesn't seem to get around to looking after it very well. I like to keep myself useful, at least when I'm not hanging around shooting the breeze like this. That was about a year's worth of conversation for me. Later, when I went for a whittle behind the rubbish bins, Henry happened to come along at the same time. That always creates a chummy feeling, having a whittle together, especially out in the open air. Damn me if he didn't get me talking about my past before my crash and burn. How I came to America from Scotland, became CEO of a decent-sized corporation. Of course, I didn't give him a name. And then I packed it all in to go to Africa on a mission to fight disease. I even told him about the legal attack and my bankruptcy and divorce. After chatting some more with Henry, I headed off for the retirement centre. One of my favourite old dears had passed away in the night. Made me sad, but I know I helped her end off with a feeling of completeness by getting her to talk about all the good things she'd done in her life. When I got back to the alley, Henry was gone. Never did see him again. Not in person, at least. Thinking it over that evening, I realised I didn't find out anything at all about him. Who was that masked man? It was a day or two later that the tall guy came into our alley. He hesitated a moment as he caught sight of us. I mean, we look a pretty rough bunch, and he probably had a fat wallet in the pocket of his nice suit. Anyway, on he came. We all looked at him curiously, wondering what was up. I'm looking for Ian. Silence. I mean, when you're in our condition, any attention from authority is bad news. What do you want him for? This was Lefty. I have a package for him, something for his benefit. This was beginning to look like that scene from the film Back to the Future where the guy from Western Union comes up with a package that's been sitting in his office for 100 years. What the hell. I'm Ian, I said. Okay, I just have to ask you one question. What country are you from? I answered, and he handed over an envelope and beat his retreat. Now, if you're smarter than I am, you may have already guessed what was in the envelope. I opened it up later when I was on my own. Funny thing was, the name at the top of the cheque was my old name from before the bankruptcy. Someone had been checking up on me. I couldn't help wondering if this thing was for real. I mean, what would you think if someone gave you a cashier's cheque for $1 million, signed William Henry Gates?